Welcome to VSOW. We are about to undertake a deep dive into a fascinating collection of sources centered on one of the most elusive and, let's be honest, often frustrating concepts in modern political life: authenticity.
Yeah, it's a slippery one.
We're-
And it's more than just asking, is this politician telling the truth? Our mission today is really to examine how fictional election campaigns in American film and television thinking about classics like The Candidate, the really biting satire of Bulworth, even the idealism of The West Wing, how these stories have tracked and maybe even measured the public's constantly shifting skepticism about who the real leader is, underneath the polished, crafted public image.
And this isn't exactly a new problem, right? But it feels like it's certainly become amplified, maybe distorted over the past, 50 years or so?
Precisely. We need to understand how the classical definition of political authenticity, which, traditionally was rooted in things like ideological conviction, consistency, virtue, how that's been systematically warped or maybe even functionally replaced
Yeah.
by the just overwhelming power of mass media, political spin, and, frankly, the sheer art of performance.
Our sources actually lay out a pretty clear chronological path. It almost feels like a historical tragedy played out on screen. We're going to trace this arc from the genesis of media cynicism back in the 1970s
Right.
through the really highly mediated spectacle of the 1980s, and then culminating in what feels like the total artifice of the 1990s.
Yeah, and then finally we'll look at the early 2000s, where you start to see fictional narratives offering a kind of hopeful, maybe even necessary escape valve, this nostalgic yearning for the real deal.
Okay, let's start at the beginning then. Let's anchor ourselves first in the sort of philosophical origins of this whole concept. We're talking about a search for the authentic that, goes way back, right? Back to Plato.
Absolutely. Plato essentially believed that nothing fake could be good and nothing good could be fake. Simple as that, almost. And this established a really enduring link in Western thought between virtue and inherent truth. That's the ideal.
So starting point.
That's the starting point. Authenticity was meant to signify that a leader's outward actions genuinely reflected an inward moral reality. But here's the big complication that the sources really highlight. Since the public rarely, if ever, enjoys actual proximity to their leaders. You can't just sit down and have coffee with the president.
Right, not usually.
So they're inevitably reliant upon mediated constructions, speeches, news clips, TV ads, now social media. And therefore, this quest for authenticity remains this dominant, telos, you could say the ultimate purpose or the core mission in American political discourse. We're always searching for it.
Which means we're constantly chasing this stable ideal that, almost by its very nature, gets distorted the moment it's presented to us through media. And even with all the rapid shifts in communication technology, that underlying desire seems pretty stable. We want to know that underneath the constructed public persona, there is a real person.
Yeah. Someone with a stable identity, a core set of beliefs. They won't just abandon the moment it becomes politically inconvenient.
So where did the profound challenge to this ideal really come from? Was it ideology or something else?
Well, the sources argue it wasn't primarily ideology, but technology, specifically the transformative power of television, starting really in the 1960s. Suddenly, the candidate's personality itself was thrust right into the foreground.
How so?
The sources emphasized that things like quirks, hairstyle, skin tone, even whether they sweated under the lights, their apparent sincerity, all that became just as crucial, sometimes more crucial, than the actual substance of their programs or platforms.
And this immediately creates that inescapable paradox of political performance, doesn't it? If a politician has to appear on television to communicate with millions, they are, just by definition, a performer.
Exactly. So their ability to perform authenticity, to project naturalness, to seem real, becomes absolutely fundamental. And a failure in that performance, regardless of the message's actual content, can instantly trigger this profound public skepticism.
Is there a moment we can point to where this really crystallized?
Oh, absolutely. And it's a classic example. The 1960 televised presidential debates between Nixon and Kennedy. They became this cultural textbook case of the bona fide versus the counterfeit image.
Right, Nixon on radio versus TV.
Exactly. Nixon's rhetorical strength was clear.
Yeah.
Apparently, radio listeners judged him the winner based on the arguments, but his visual appearance on television was, an absolute performative failure.
He just didn't get the medium yet.
Didn't get it at all. He was sweating under the hot lights, he refused makeup, looked sickly, stressed. The sources use language like he was visually transmogrified, appearing glowing and heavy, whereas Kennedy, meanwhile, looked tanned, confident, youthful. He projected this effortless forcefulness. The image, not necessarily the words, became the arbiter of perceived truth for millions watching.
And this systemic reliance on, well, staged imagery didn't go unnoticed even then.
No, it led thinkers like Daniel Boorstin to articulate a really deep skepticism as early as 1961. Boorstin famously argued that American politics was rapidly devolving into nothing more than a series of pseudo-events.
Pseudo-events.
Yeah, these are stage-managed photo opportunities, basically. They weren't valued for being intrinsically real or meaningful, but only because they were newsworthy. They'd make the evening news, the staged event itself becomes the substance.
Okay, and this growing kind of palpable cynicism, how did it find its way into film?
Well, its perfect cinematic expression, according to our sources, arrived in Michael Ritchie's 1972 film, The Candidate. This film is just a definitive exploration of what happens when an idealistic individual enters a system that's already defined by these pseudo-events and this intense image control.
What's the setup there?
The setup is actually genius because it almost guarantees failure, or at least compromise. Bill McKay, played by Robert Redford, he's this idealistic lawyer. He agrees to run for the Senate against the entrenched incumbent, Crocker Jarman.
Okay.
And the only reason he agrees is because everyone assumes the race is unwinnable. Which means, theoretically, he could just speak his mind with no consequences and stay totally true to his principles.
Ah, but then things changed.
Exactly. As tends to happen in politics, McKay starts to gain traction unexpectedly, and the system immediately begins its process of, well, destruction and assimilation.
Yeah.
And this is where the film gets so specific about the actual mechanisms of inauthenticity.
How does it show that?
His staff immediately takes over and begins this process of repackaging. We literally see him undergoing intense body language coaching, right? To make sure his gestures look authentic and powerful, he's forced into makeup. They construct the appearance of a domestically serene life through staged photo ops, even as the campaign itself is actively destroying his real-life marriage. The film shows, in really painful detail, the triumph of iconography over actual policy.
That distinction feels crucial, the symbol over the substance.
It is. The staff explicitly decides to prioritize footage of McKay confidently throwing a football, very carefully framed to make him look Kennedy-esque.
The Kennedy image.
Right. They prioritize that over footage of him actually trying to outline complex, substantive healthcare policies in a crowded, chaotic waiting room full of screaming babies.
Okay.
The message is simple. A 5-second staged symbol of youthful vigor beats 5 minutes of stumbling, maybe more authentic policy discussion every time.
And the media plays along in this.
Absolutely. The media collaborates in this reduction, turning McKay into what the sources call a political cipher, just an empty vessel. There's a news report within the film that openly suggests that voters are being asked to choose McKay in the same kind of arbitrary, non-substantive way they might choose laundry detergent. He's just a commodity with a brand label.
Wow. Does the film visually represent this transformation, too?
It does, brilliantly. It offers this profound visual analysis of inauthenticity during the climactic debate scene. McKay's image shifts from being mediated just once by the film's camera, which we, the audience, tend to trust, to being seen only through the viewfinder of the debate studio camera.
So we're seeing him as the TV audience sees him.
Exactly. It visually signifies that he has been entirely transformed into a media product. His true self is sort of no longer present. Only the mediated image exists. At times, his image is even superimposed over his opponents, making the two visually almost indistinguishable. It's all just image.
And the ending.
The conclusion is the ultimate indictment of the political system's power to just consume principle. McKay actually wins the race. But his policies, his principles, they've been so thoroughly undermined and compromised along the way that he genuinely has no idea what to do with his victory.
Leading to that famous line.
The famous final line to his manager, just a whisper of absolute confusion and loss. What do we do now? It perfectly emphasizes that the system succeeded. It eroded his agency, his purpose. What's left is just the package, the win, completely devoid of meaning. The 70s, through films like this, established that authenticity isn't necessarily violently killed, but it's gradually systemically lost.
Okay, so if the 1970s showed authenticity being lost in the media noise, the 1980s seemed to usher in an era where the image wasn't just a necessary evil, but almost a celebrated, sophisticated spectacle. And this was really crystallized by the election of Ronald Reagan, right? A former Hollywood actor.
Exactly. It seemed to suggest that politics had entirely, or almost entirely, surrendered to the manufactured image. The image itself became the core competency, not just some unfortunate side effect. Reagan's campaign openly embraced this high production value spectacle. They viewed it almost as a marker of competence rather than artifice.
You're talking about ads like Morning in America.
Precisely. The 1984 campaign film, Morning in America. This wasn't some quick, cheap video. It was shot on high-quality 35mm film stock, the same kind used for major motion pictures, and crucially, high-end advertising.
And it deliberately mirrored those ads.
Openly and deliberately. It was modeled on ads for huge American commodities, Pepsi, McDonald's, Chevrolet. It was literally selling the president exactly the way Madison Avenue sold consumer goods.
Using what kind of imagery?
Pure, nostalgic, soft-focus dreams. Montages of white picket fences, American flags rippling beautifully, slow-motion shots of, white weddings. It was all designed to evoke this sense of pre-war idealized stability.
And the effect?
The rhetorical effect was staggering. It sold Reagan as a commodity, a feeling, really, a dream of a past America that you could basically purchase with your vote. But for critical observers, that high production value, the visual and rhetorical excess, that became the new, immediate marker of inauthenticity. The very expense and polish were seen as proof of the lie.
So this excess, this almost resignation to the power of the image, must have fueled some satirical responses later in the 80s.
Oh, absolutely. Particularly Robert Altman's really caustic 1988 miniseries, Tanner 88. This series takes the cynicism we saw in The Candidate and just applies this kind of defeated, resigned layer to it.
What was so unique about Tanner 88?
Well, structurally, it was revolutionary for its time because it audaciously blurred the lines between the real and the fictional. You have this fictional congressman, Jack Tanner, running alongside real candidates like Bob Dole, Gary Hart, Michael Dukakis, who actually interact with him on screen. Yeah. This blending immediately suggests that Tanner's fictional campaign is somehow just as real and just as controlled as the actual political races happening around him.
And it critiques the image-making process itself.
Yes, definitely. The series critiques the entire machinery of image control, showing how even a genuinely thoughtful candidate like Tanner is inevitably forced into the spectacle. They try to make a standard, glossy campaign film, directed by his staffer, Deke. And it instantly becomes, as our sources note, the very definition of inauthenticity.
Why does it fail so badly?
It fails because Deke tries to mimic that successful Reagan-Bush style, relying on these arbitrary, completely cliched rhetorical devices. They throw in images of Pearl Harbor, show footage of JFK, use dramatic, swelling music, trying to instantly associate Tanner with this pre-packaged history of American greatness, even though Tanner himself has no actual historical connection to any of those moments.
So it feels forced.
Totally forced. And the moment of failure is when they show the film to a focus group, and the group just immediately sees through the staged performance. They hate it because it feels false, manipulative.
So what do they do then?
So the staff pivots desperately. They decide to use a moment that actually felt genuine. This improvised emotional rant Tanner delivered earlier in the campaign. But crucially, this rant was filmed secretly, without his knowledge, from underneath a coffee table.
From under a coffee table?
Yeah. So because the footage is kind of distorted by the glass and poorly framed, it accidentally achieves this visual effect that paradoxically makes it appear more genuine than the slick 35mm shot glossy ad. It looks accidental, spontaneous, and therefore real.
Ah, but there's a catch.
There's the catch. The core insight of Tanner 88 is that this attempt is also doomed. And why? Because the very need to repackage that supposedly authentic moment, editing it, adding music, putting text overlays, distributing it back into the campaign material, that process renders it artificial all over again.
So you can't capture authenticity and then sell it.
That's the profound lesson here, and it really summarizes the 1980s shift perfectly. The fact of mediation itself instantaneously undermines any claimed authenticity. Tanner 88 basically argues that the pursuit of authenticity through mass media is doomed from the outset, because the moment you film the real thing and try to package and sell it, you've corrupted it. This signaled a shift from just losing authenticity to kind of resigning ourselves to the fact that maybe we can never truly find it, at least not through the campaign process.
Okay, so if the 80s was about resignation to the image, the 1990s seems to embrace total artifice. The whole atmosphere around the Clinton presidency, for instance, seemed to shift the expectation. It became less about hiding the mechanics of spin.
Right, and more about almost publicly displaying the practice of political image construction.
Yeah.
This is where we get this idea of meta-imaging.
Meta-imaging.
Yeah, and the foundational text for this change wasn't even a satire, it's a documentary. 1993's The War Room. This film gave viewers this unprecedented, privileged backstage access to Clinton's chief strategists, James Carville and George Stephanopoulos.
I remember that. It felt like you were seeing how the sausage was made.
Exactly. And this process of meta-imaging,
Mm-hmm.
publicly watching the image being built, it created the illusion that you, the viewer, were smart enough to unmask the image to see the real candidate underneath all the spin.
It's a clever trick, actually.
It is. The audience feels knowledgeable because they've seen the strings being pulled.
Yeah.
And in this environment, the sources suggest that knowing how the candidate was manufactured essentially became the new accepted definition of authenticity. If you understood the game, you felt like you were in on the secret, like you weren't being fooled.
But this acceptance of total image management, it must have set the stage for something even more extreme.
Oh, it absolutely did. It set the stage for the total, almost nihilistic illusion depicted in 1997's Wag the Dog. This film represents the logical, maybe terrifying conclusion of that 1990s spin culture.
And Wag the Dog was almost eerily prescient, wasn't it? Released just before the Lewinsky scandal broke.
Uncannily so. It posits that absolutely everything is potentially a media-manufactured illusion. The film's whole plot revolves around fabricating an entire international crisis, a war with Albania, simply to distract the public from a presidential sex scandal.
And the president himself is barely relevant in the film.
Almost completely irrelevant. He's this passive figure who rarely even appears on screen. Authenticity, in this world, is entirely manufactured and controlled by spin doctors and, significantly, Hollywood producers they bring in. The film cynically demonstrates how you can co-opt the traditional markers of truth to create a completely fake reality.
How do they show that? With the war footage?
Exactly. They manufacture war footage in a Hollywood studio, and they specifically use the cultural shorthand of the handheld camera, which, as viewers, we associate with documentary immediacy, with validity. They use that look to fake authenticity.
And there was that detail about the cat.
Oh yeah, the level of detail is chilling. To heighten the emotional impact of this fictional conflict, they show a young Albanian girl running from gunfire, desperately clutching a kitten. But the director later confesses, quite casually, that the kitten was added digitally in post-production.
Wow.
Yeah. The emotional anchor of this scene, the thing designed to pull at your heartstrings, is pure computer graphics.
Which leads to that incredibly cynical line from the spin doctor.
Conrad Breen, yeah. He asserts a total collapse of objective reality when he says, "Of course there's a war, I'm watching it on television." The existence of the media image is the only proof required. Reality is what's on TV.
So Wag the Dog's final message is pretty bleak.
Utterly bleak. It asserts that television has essentially destroyed the electoral process, leading to things like an 89% approval rating based not on actual verifiable events, but purely on the spin given to those events. Politics in this view is just a performance, a pageant of manufactured consent, nothing more.
Okay, but running parallel to this idea of total artifice, there was another critical perspective emerging in the 90s, right? Focusing more on, say, the nature of populism. I'm thinking of Tim Robbins' 1992 mockumentary, Bob Roberts.
Yes, Bob Roberts provides a different but equally critical lens. It's about this self-made millionaire and folk singer, Bob Roberts, running for Senate in Pennsylvania. And Roberts embodies this really grotesque contradiction. He has this open-faced, seemingly honest look, this infectious grin.
The folk singer persona.
Right. But he sings songs with titles like "The Times They Are Changin' Back." And his core message is basically a celebration of deregulation and the idea that greed is good. It's Reaganomics set to folk music.
And the film argues this is a different kind of populism.
Completely different from the historical version, which was often rooted in working-class solidarity. Roberts' populism, the film argues, is inherently divisive. It attempts to mask the real enemy, who the film suggests are the profit-takers, the corporate interests, by deliberately stirring up internal resentment. Race against race, worker against worker, with hate being stirred up.
And the visuals of the film reinforce this.
They do. Our sources observe that in certain lighting conditions, Roberts' infectious grin can instantly morph into this mask of anger, making him look, they say, uncannily like another famous two-faced populist figure, Citizen Kane. He co-opts the genre of folk music, traditionally associated with, homespun honesty, agrarian truth, to sell these reactionary, self-serving policies.
And behind the scenes, the campaign is corrupt.
Oh, completely drenched in corruption. But it's hidden behind this carefully constructed facade of the folksy singer. His campaign bus, for instance, functions as this high-tech trading center for brokers. There are persistent rumors flying around about his involvement in arms deals, savings, and loan scandals, suggesting his apparent popular appeal is merely a cover for pure corporate self-interest.
And his campaign manager.
Played brilliantly by Alan Rickman. He embodies pure, real politic. The pragmatic, cynical acceptance that any means, no matter how ethically bankrupt, are justified if they help you win. And this is demonstrated perfectly when they execute the ultimate dirty trick against his liberal opponent, Senator Brickley Paste, who's played by Gore Vidal, no less.
What do they do?
They attack Paste for supposedly dating teenage girls, providing these photos that look incredibly damning. Paste protests, frantically explaining the photos are actually of my daughter's best friend. My daughter was cut out of the picture.
They literally doctored the photo.
They just cropped the photo to create the scandal. But crucially, the public and the media in the film, they don't really care about the truth. The mere existence of the photographs and the resulting media spectacle is enough to completely destroy Paste's campaign.
So it shows how the markers of authenticity, or maybe the markers of scandal, can be weaponized, even if they're fake.
Exactly. The corruption isn't just in the hidden policies. It's in the open manufactured lies that the public seems willing to accept as truth simply because they are sensational and fit a narrative.
Okay, so in stark contrast to the systematic lies of Bob Roberts and well, the nihilism of Wag the Dog, we finished the 90s with a very different kind of film, Warren Beatty's Bulworth from 1998. This one seems to try and locate authenticity not through image control, but through something else.
Through radical, almost farcical, and potentially self-destructive honesty. Bulworth is a truly wild film. It blends scathing satire with political manifesto and throws in a good dose of farce.
What was Bulworth?
Senator J. Billington Bulworth is this deeply cynical, moderate Democrat. He's afflicted by a moral crisis because he knows he completely abandoned his core liberal principles following the Reagan Revolution in the 80s. His political strategy of triangulation, always trying to occupy the safe middle ground, is explicitly identified in the film as mimicking Bill Clinton's real-world political strategy at the time.
And what drives him to change?
He's driven to despair by his own hypocrisy. So, he arranges his own assassination, takes out a massive life insurance policy for his family, which guarantees, he thinks, that he can finally speak his mind. Because, much like McKay in The Candidate, he believes there are no consequences if he's about to die anyway.
So he finds authenticity through impending death.
Sort of. His rebirth into honesty appropriately begins in a black church in South Central Los Angeles, a place with a long history of political activism. He just drops the political veneer entirely and bluntly tells the African-American parishioners the hard truth. Democrats don't actually care about their specific concerns because, frankly, they don't vote in high enough numbers or contribute enough money to really matter politically. This brutal, shocking honesty immediately sets him on this new, arguably authentic path.
But then the transformation gets weird.
He gets very weird. It swiftly becomes this bizarre spectacle as he embraces the persona of the rapping homeboy, embodying this concept Norman Mailer once wrote about, the white Negro.
And why hip-hop?
This hip-hop transformation is the vehicle for his message. His rhyming allows him, the film suggests, to communicate directly with the underclass by speaking what it portrays as a reconstructed English, the language of the ghetto, the language of the street, rather than the formal, traditional English of the elite oppressor. It's this radical attempt to break down class communication barriers.
And what is his core message delivered through rap?
It's an explicit, class-based manifesto. Bulworth proclaims that poor whites and poor blacks actually share an identical plight, but they are systematically divided along constructed racial lines by the wealthy white elite to maintain power. When he's later questioned about his use of profanity on national television, he famously raps that the true profanity isn't his language, but the rich getting richer. That's the obscenity.
Does this radical honesty work politically?
Astonishingly, yes. Despite the completely radical nature of his transformation and his message, his raw honesty connects with voters and his poll numbers soar. People respond to the authenticity, however bizarrely packaged.
But the ending is tragic.
The ending is inevitable and piercingly cynical. Bulworth is shot and killed. But crucially, he's not killed by the mobster he originally hired for his own assassination plot.
Who kills him then?
Instead, he is killed by an outraged insurance industry lobbyist, basically paying him back for threatening to block crucial insurance reform legislation that would hurt profits. The film's commentary here is crystal clear. Normally, moneyed interests kill unwanted political measures quietly, through backroom deals in Congress, not through literal homicide. The actual murder of Bulworth serves as this final, brutal metaphor for the killing of genuine reform and authentic class-based politics by entrenched structural financial power.
Okay, so as we move out of the 90s and transition into the 2000s, the cultural barometer seems to shift again, moving away from that total nihilism we saw in films like Wag the Dog. Right. The sources highlight a pretty dramatic change in tone, maybe best epitomized by narratives like Aaron Sorkin's The West Wing, which ran from 1999 to 2006. This show offered a really defiant, optimistic vision, almost a clear, nostalgic escape that seemed to be yearning for the return of the Capra-esque hero.
Exactly. Frank Capra films like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. This shift was a direct counterpoint to the deep cynicism we were just talking about. The West Wing fundamentally reasserted the possibility that an exceptional individual, specifically an outsider, could somehow transcend all the political artifice, bypass the spin doctors, and return the political system to some kind of ethical, righteous path.
And who embodies this ideal in the show?
The show focuses heavily on the presidential campaign of Congressman Matt Santos. He's presented as the archetype of this idealized outsider, Hispanic, working-class background from Texas, a decorated Gulf War veteran. His claim to authenticity is built not just on his compelling backstory, but on his unwavering commitment to his ideological core, particularly on issues like healthcare and education. He's shown explicitly prioritizing his beliefs over simple career advancement.
And there's that line about healthcare.
Yeah, he famously articulates this when he's explaining his willingness to potentially leave politics altogether to actually open hospitals back home. He says, that's not a healthcare agenda, that's healthcare. He sees the policy, the real-world outcome, as the authentic thing, while the political maneuvering around it is the inauthentic distraction.
So, to make Santos seem authentic, the show needs a counterpoint, right? An inauthentic figure.
Absolutely. To establish Santos's authenticity, the show has to clearly define its villain, the quintessential, inauthentic, beltway politician. And this archetype is embodied perfectly by Vice President Bob Russell, played by Gary Cole. He's portrayed as utterly and inextricably wedded to the party establishment, the insider's insider.
And how do they show his fakeness?
Well, Russell's policies are meticulously triangulated and poll-tested, always designed for maximum political safety and minimum risk. And the show just meticulously catalogs his markers of fakeness. He tells the same universally unfunny joke over and over again. He liberally gives out Russell-branded merchandise, things like letter openers, cup holders, as if his entire identity were just a corporate logo.
Even his attempts at seeming normal backfire.
Completely. He wears cowboy boots in this deliberate, really ham-fisted effort, as the sources call it, to project rural authenticity, despite being clearly established as a lifelong Washington, D.C. insider. The show essentially uses all these little details to render him a living cliché, proof that he exists primarily to please his handlers and pollsters, not to stand for anything real.
And wasn't there something about a cardboard cutout?
Oh, yes. The ultimate condemnation comes from the fact that Russell literally has a life-sized cardboard cutout of himself created as campaign merchandise. And the staff themselves acknowledge the absurdity and the tragedy of it. One staffer notes quite sadly that the fake two-dimensional cardboard Russell fulfills the exact same public function as the real three-dimensional man. It reinforces the idea that the replica is the man. There's no substance underneath.
So the West Wing really successfully uses that term beltway politician as a shorthand for inauthenticity.
It does. It weaponizes the term, defining it as someone who compromises core principles for the sake of campaign finance, someone who consistently pursues only politically prudent, poll-tested policies rather than substantive, deeply held ones. And Santos, the maverick outsider, is positioned as the unique, singular figure opposed to all of this manufactured conformity.
And interestingly, the show even seems to attempt a kind of redemption for television itself as a medium, contrasting with how films like The Candidate or Wag the Dog portrayed it.
That's a great point. Santos aims to move away from all the manipulative ads. He even dismisses this cheap, ridiculous ad his own staff put together featuring a man in a chicken suit attacking his opponent. He wants none of that.
So what's his alternative?
His counter-strategy becomes the live advertisement. Santos consciously rejects polish, rejects gimmickry. He literally goes down to the television studio to deliver his message live, completely unscripted, speaking directly to the camera, directly to the viewer. He openly laments the dishonesty and the lack of integrity that he sees as having infested modern campaigning. He positions himself as someone who refuses to hide behind that media artifice.
Promising transparency.
Total transparency. His pledge is essentially, I will not say anything about my opponents or the issues at stake without saying it myself right here, right into this camera. And his closing statement relies entirely on this discursive construction of liveness and immediacy, the very qualities, ironically, for which television was originally celebrated decades earlier to guarantee his truthfulness.
And that tagline became iconic.
It did. The line, delivered just once per ad, always with this quiet gravitas, is, I'm Matt Santos, and you better believe I approve this ad. It's this radical rearticulation of the standard, legally required political disclaimer. Instead of just being a formality, it becomes an ideological guarantee, a personal signature of integrity in the digital age. The show strongly suggests that transparency and unscripted sincerity can reclaim the political narrative from the spin doctors.
And this fictional yearning for the outsider, the maverick who speaks truth to power, this wasn't just happening in fiction, right? It echoed real-world politics around that time.
Absolutely. It directly echoes the real-world political trends that really peaked in the 2008 U.S. election cycle. You had candidates like Barack Obama, John McCain, even Sarah Palin, all, to varying degrees, cultivating this outsider status to differentiate themselves from the perceived phoniness of politics as usual. Well, authenticity was suddenly linked back again to ideological conviction and, crucially, a demonstrable willingness to challenge the status quo. For Obama, his early opposition to the Iraq War became a key marker of authenticity. McCain championed his maverick status, remember the Straight Talk Express bus?
I do.
And Sarah Palin positioned herself as this unreconstructed representative of real America, explicitly distant from the Washington, D.C. elite. The appeal, both in the fiction of The West Wing and in the reality of 2008, lay in this powerful promise of the unmediated, honest agent who could cut through the noise.
Okay, so this deep dive has really shown a powerful, almost dramatic narrative arc in how American culture, through film and TV, has grappled with political authenticity. We started back in the 1970s, where authenticity was portrayed as something gradually tragically lost through the grinding demands of image management, perfectly captured in the candidate.
Yeah, and this evolved into the kind of total artifice we saw dominating the 1990s, where the cynical conclusion seemed to be that authenticity was entirely manufactured by spin doctors, epitomized by the, frankly, terrifying nihilism of Wag the Dog.
And then finally, we saw this cultural counterreaction in the 2000s where popular narratives like The West Wing desperately sought to reestablish the possibility of that Capra-esque hero, the pure outsider, who could maybe return the system to some kind of moral foundation.
Right, and while these fictional narratives like The West Wing, they can conveniently sidestep the complexities of real politics and indulge this traditional ideal of authenticity, our sources argue that this often functions as a kind of necessary emotional escape for the public. The fundamental tension between the fabricated performance that politics seems to require and our deep, abiding yearning for the real thing, the tension remains fundamentally unresolved in reality.
Which perhaps leads to a final, maybe necessary insight from all this. Since the political candidate today is almost necessarily a performative entity, perhaps it's actually best that our powerful thirst for political authenticity gets quenched primarily in fiction.
That's an interesting thought.
Because maybe this, ironically, allows us to continue viewing actual political reality with the requisite skepticism and rationality that's probably required for a healthy democracy.
That does raise a final, maybe provocative thought for you, the listener, to consider. We've pretty much established that performance seems unavoidable in modern politics. If that really is true, then what is the ultimate measure of authenticity? Is it simply the quality of the lie, how convincing the performance is? Or is it maybe the radical transparency with which the performance itself is delivered? Something to think about.
Definitely something to think about. If you want more deep dives like this one, exploring sources and ideas, be sure to subscribe, like, and comment wherever you happen to get your audio. Thank you for listening to VSOW.